The Bennet family dines together.
I hope, my dear, you have ordered a good dinner today, because I have reason to expect an addition to our family party.
Bingley? Oh, why, Jane, you sly thing, you never dropped a word. Oh, and not a fish to be got. Oh, Lord. Lydia, my love, ring the bell. I must speak to Hill directly.
It is not Mr. Bingley. It is a person I never saw in the whole course of my life.
Colonel Forster.
Captain Carter.
No, I know. Denny.
About a month ago, I received this letter, and about a fortnight ago, I answered it, for I thought it was a case of some delicacy and requiring early attention. It is from my cousin, Mr. Collins, who, when I am dead, may turn you all out of this house as soon as he pleases.
Oh, my dear, pray don't mention that odious man. I think it's the hardest thing in the world that your estate that should be entailed away from your own poor children.
Indeed, my dear, nothing can clear Mr. Collins of the iniquitous crime of inheriting Longbourn. But if you will listen to his letter, you may be softened by his manner of expressing himself. My dear sir, the disagreement subsisting between yourself and my late honoured father always gave me much uneasiness, and since I have had the misfortune to lose him, I have frequently wished to heal the breach. There, Mrs. Bennet. My mind, however, now is made up on the subject.
Having received my ordination at Easter, I've been so fortunate as to be distinguished by the patronage of the Right Honourable Lady Catherine de Bourgh, whose bounty and beneficence has preferred me to the valuable rectory at Hunsford, where it is my earnest endeavour to demean myself with grateful respect towards her ladyship. As a clergyman, moreover, I feel it my duty to promote and establish the blessing of peace in all families within the reach of my influence. And on these grounds, I flatter myself that my present overtures of goodwill are highly commendable and will not lead you to reject the offered olive branch. I am, sir, keenly conscious of being the means of injuring your amiable daughters, and assure you of my readiness to make them every possible amends. I propose myself the satisfaction of waiting on you and your family on Monday the 18th, and shall probably trespass on your hospitality till the Saturday seven-night following. I shall travel as far as the turnpike in my own modest equipage, where I hope to catch the Bromley post at 35 minutes past 10, and thence to Watford, from whence I shall engage a hired carriage to transport me to Longbourn, where, God willing, you may expect me by 4 in the afternoon.
Mr. Collins's carriage approaches Longbourn, and the family comes out to greet him.
And here he comes.
He must be an oddity, don't you think?
Well, if he's disposed to make our girls any amends, I shan't be the person to discourage him.
And he a sensible man, sir?
Oh, I think not, my dear. Indeed, I have great hopes of finding him quite the reverse. Mr. Collins, you're very welcome.
My dear Mr. and Mrs. Bennet.
The Bennets and Mr. Collins sit down to dinner.
You seem very fortunate in your patroness, sir.
Lady Catherine de Bourgh. Indeed I am, sir. I've been treated with such affability, such condescension as I would never have dared to hope for. I've been invited twice to dine at Rosings Park.
That's so amazing, eh?
Does she live near you, sir?
The garden in which stands my humble abode is separated only by a lane from Rosings Park.
Only a lane. Well, fancy that, Lizzie.
I think you said she was a widow, sir, but has she any family?
Oh, she has one daughter, ma'am, the heiress of Rosings, and a very extensive property.
And has she been presented at court?
She is unfortunately of a sickly constitution, which unhappily prevents her being in town. And by that means, as I told Lady Catherine myself one day, she has deprived the British court of its brightest ornament. You may imagine, sir, how happy I am on every occasion to offer those little delicate compliments which are always acceptable to ladies.
It is fortunate for you, Mr. Collins, that you possess such an extraordinary talent for flattering with delicacy. May I ask whether these pleasing attentions proceed from the impulse of the moment, or are they the result of previous study?
They arise chiefly from what is passing at the time, sir. I do sometimes amuse myself by writing down and arranging such little compliments as may be adapted to ordinary occasions, but I try to give them as unstudied an air as possible.
Excellent. Excellent.
Mr. Collins smiles warmly at Jane. Mrs. Bennet notices, and Jane avoids his gaze by looking down and drinking her water. Lydia and Kitty giggle as they play horseshoes. Mary walks as she reads a book. Jane and Elizabeth talk as they stroll together. Mr. Collins walks with Mrs. Bennet.
I must confess myself quite overwhelmed with the charms of your daughters, Mrs. Bennet.
Oh, you are very kind, sir. They are sweet girls, though. I do say it so myself.
Perhaps especially the eldest, Miss Bennet?
Ah, yes. Jane is admired wherever she goes, but I think I should tell you, Mr. Collins, I think it very likely that she'll soon be engaged.
Ah.
As for my younger daughters, though, if any of them, in their case, I know of, well, no prior attachment at all.
Ah.
We're all going to Meryton, Mamma, to see if Denny's returned from town.
Oh, well, perhaps you would care for a little exercise, Mr. Collins.
Oh, indeed I would, Mrs. Bennet. Cousin Elizabeth, would you do me the great honour of walking with me into town?
The Bennet girls and Mr. Collins walk across the bridge into Meryton.
You visit your Aunt Phillips in Meryton frequently, I understand, cousin.
Yes, she is very fond of company, but I'm afraid you'll find her gathering poor affairs after the splendours of Rosings Park.
Oh, no, I think not. I believe I possess the happy knack, much to be desired in a clergyman, of adapting myself to every kind of society, whether high or low.
Well, that is fortunate, indeed.
Yes, indeed. And though it is a gift of nature, constant study has enabled me, I flatter myself, to make a kind of art of it.
There. I'm sure that is new since Friday. Isn't it nice? Do you think I'd look well in it?
Not as well as me. Come on.
No, I shan't. Jane, come here. Look at this. Jane, I'm determined to have this bonnet.
Oh, Kitty.
Oh, look, there's Denny.
Where?
There, look.
Who's that with him?
Oh, I don't know.
He's fearful handsome.
He might be if he were in regimentals. I think a man looks nothing without regimentals.
Oh, the looking over. Lizzie, is he not mightily good looking?
Denny!
Lydia.
Lydia and Kitty wave, and Denny crosses the street with his friend.
What a fine joke! We thought you were still in town.
There's nothing amusing enough to hold us there. Allow me to introduce you to my friend, George Wickham. Miss Bennet, Miss Elizabeth Bennet, Miss Mary Bennet, Miss Catherine Bennet, and, Miss Lydia Bennet.
This is our cousin, Mr. Collins.
Do you stay long in Meryton, Mr. Wickham?
All winter, I'm happy to say. I've taken a commission in Colonel Forster's regiment.
There, Lydia. He will be dressed in regimentals.
And lend them much distinction, I dare say. Out to swagger us all, eh, Wickham?
Denny, you misrepresent me to these young ladies.
Shall you come with us to our Aunt Phillips this evening, Mr. Wickham?
Oh, yes! Denny is coming, you know.
It's only supper and cards, but we shall have some laughs.
I'm afraid I have not been invited by Mr. and Mrs. Phillips.
Oh, no one cares about that sort of thing nowadays.
Well, if Mrs. Phillips extended the invitation to include me, I should be delighted.
Bingley and Darcy ride by on horses. Bingley dismounts to greet them.
Look, Jane, it's Mr. Bingley.
How very fortunate. Do you know, we were just on our way to Longbourn to ask after your health.
Elizabeth looks up at Darcy, who is about to dismount. Wickham turns to look at him and Darcy stops.
You are very kind, sir. I am quite recovered, as you see.
Yes, I am very glad to know it.
I hope you will you're still willing to come to tea with us.
Wickham bows, but Darcy rides on. Mr. Collins stands in a group with Mrs. Phillips, Jane, and Elizabeth.
And what a charming apartment you have here, Mrs. Phillips.
Oh!
Upon my word, it reminds me greatly of a small summer breakfast room at Rosings.
Oh, does it indeed, sir? I'm much obliged to you, I'm sure.
I'm sure that Mr. Collins wishes to pay a compliment, Aunt.
Does he? I see.
Rosings Parks, we must understand, is very grand indeed.
Oh, indeed it is. Oh, my dear madam, if you thought I intended any slight on your excellent and very comfortable arrangement, I am mortified. Rosings Park is the residence of my noble patroness, Lady Catherine de Bourgh.
Oh, but now I understand.
The chimney piece in the second drawing room alone cost £800.
Oh, now I see. It's clear there's no offence at all. Will you oblige me and sit down to a game of whist?
I must confess I know little of the game, madam, but I shall be glad to improve myself if my fair cousin will consent to release me.
With all my heart, sir.
Mr. Collins and Mrs. Phillips smile and leave. Mr. Wickham steps slowly away from the younger Bennet sisters and sits next to Elizabeth.
I must confess, I thought I should never escape your younger sisters.
They can be very determined, Lydia especially.
But they're pleasant girls. Indeed, I find that society in Hertfordshire quite exceeds my expectations. I don't see Mr. Bingley and his friends this evening.
I think some of Mr. Bingley's friends would consider it beneath their dignity.
Really, Have you known Mr. Darcy long?
About a month?
I have known him all my life. We played together as children.
But...
Yes, you are surprised. Perhaps you might have noticed the cold manner of our greeting.
I confess I did.
Are you much acquainted with Mr. Darcy?
As much as I ever wish to be. I've spent 3 days in the same house with him, and I find him very disagreeable.
I fear there are few who would share that opinion, except myself.
Oh, but he is not at all liked in Hertfordshire. Everybody is disgusted with his pride.
Do you know, does he intend to stay long at Netherfield?
I do not know, but I hope his being in the neighbourhood will not affect your plans to stay.
Thank you, but it is not for me to be driven away by Mr. Darcy. If he wishes to avoid seeing me, he must go. Oh, we are not on friendly terms, but I have no reason to avoid him but one. He has done me great wrong. His father, Miss Bennet, the late Mr. Darcy, was my godfather and one of the best men that ever breathed. My father was his steward, and when he died, old Mr. Darcy cared for me and provided for me. Loved me, I believe, as though I were his own son. He intended me for the church, and it was my dearest wish to enter into that profession. But after he died, and the living he promised me fell vacant, the son refused point blank to honour his father's promises. So you see, I have to make my own way in the world.
This is quite shocking. I had not thought Mr. Darcy to be as bad as this. To descend to such malicious revenge. He deserves to be publicly disgraced.
And someday he will be, but not by me. Till I can forget his father, I can never defy or expose him.
I wonder at the pride of this man. How abominable. You are more temperate than I should be in your situation.
Well, I have not the resentful temper some men have. And my situation, it's not so bad. At present, I have every cause for cheer. I can't bear to be idle, and my new profession gives me active employment. My fellow officers are excellent men, and now I find myself in a society as agreeable as any I have ever known. You see, I absolutely forbid you to feel sorry for me.
Lizzie, why would you feel sorry for Mr. Wickham?
Why? Because I have not had a dance these 3 months together.
Oh, poor Mr. Wickham! Why, you shall have one now. Mary, the cross of Inverness.
Lydia and Wickham begin to dance. Late that evening, Jane and Elizabeth sit in Jane's bedroom. Elizabeth sits on the bed and Jane gets up from the chair.
I cannot believe it, Lizzie. Mr. Darcy would have far too high respect for his father's wishes to behave in such an unchristian manner. And Lizzie, consider, how could his most intimate friends be so deceived in him?
I could more easily imagine Mr. Bingley being imposed upon than to think that Mr. Wickham could invent such a history.
I believe you like Mr. Wickham, Lizzie.
Well, I confess, I do like him. I do not see how anyone could not like him. There is something very open and artless in his manner. He feels deeply, I believe, and yet has a natural merriment and energy, despite all this. Yes, Jane, I confess, I like him very much.
But after so short an acquaintance, do you think we should believe in him so implicitly?
How could he be doubted? He gave me all the circumstances, Jane. Names, facts, and everything without ceremony. If it isn't so, let Mr. Darcy contradict it. Besides, there was truth in all his looks.
It is difficult indeed. It is distressing. One does not know what to think.
I beg your pardon. One knows exactly what to think.
Mr. Bennet pours himself a drink. The other Bennets and Mr. Collins are in the drawing room.
Girls, we've been invited to a ball at Netherfield.
Oh, good. I love a ball.
And so do I.
Oh, this will be a compliment to you, Jane, you know. Oh, and the invitation includes you too, Mr. Collins.
But shall you accept, sir? Would it be entirely proper? Would your bishop approve?
Your scruples do you credit, my dear cousin. But I am of the opinion that a ball of this kind, given by a man of good character to respectable people, can have no evil tendency. And I am so far from objecting to dancing myself that I shall hope to be honoured with the hands of all my fair cousins during the course of the evening. And I take this opportunity of soliciting yours.
Mary looks hopefully, but Mr. Collins leans towards Elizabeth.
Miss Elizabeth for the first two dances. La da 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 da.
Denny and another officer push a laughing Kitty and Lydia on a two-person swing, and Elizabeth and Wickham walk together.
Have you made Mr. Bingley's acquaintance yet?
No, but I am already disposed to approve of him. He's issued a general invitation to the officers for his ball at Netherfield, which has caused great joy in more than one quarter. He must be a very amiable gentleman.
Oh, yes. He is eager to approve of everyone he meets. But he is a sensible man with taste and judgment. I wonder very much how Mr. Darcy could impose upon him. But he cannot know what Mr. Darcy is.
Probably not. Mr. Darcy can please when he chooses, if he thinks it's worth his while. Among his equals in wealth and consequence, he can be very liberal-minded, honourable, even agreeable.
I wonder you can speak of him so tolerantly.
He's not wholly bad.
Tell me, sir, what sort of girl is Miss Darcy?
Well, I wish I could call her amiable. As a child, she was affectionate and pleasing and extremely fond of me. I have devoted hours to her amusement, but she has grown too much like her brother, very proud. I never see her now. Since her father's death, her home has been in London. She's but 16 years old, your sister Lydia's age.
Lydia's only 15.
I was amused by your cousin's reference to Lady Catherine de Bourgh. She's Mr. Darcy's aunt, you know, and her daughter, Anne, who will inherit a very large fortune, is destined to be Mr. Darcy's bride.
Really? Oh, poor Miss Bingley.
Allow me, Cousin Elizabeth.
Collins helps Elizabeth, who hops out, followed by a more graceful Jane. They walk up a few steps and Elizabeth sees Mr. Darcy in an upper room. Darcy looks away. Jane and Elizabeth enter the front hall. Servants help them remove their cloaks and they step into the host reception queue.
Miss Bennet.
Oh, my dear Jane, how delightful to see you and so well recovered.
How pleasant to see you.
Louisa and I have been quite desolate without you, haven't we? Mr. Hurst.
What?
Oh, Mrs. Bennet.
Delighted.
Miss Bennet.
Mr. Bennet.
Oh, Mrs. Bennet, Mr. Bennet, quite delighted. Ah, and all your daughters.
Oh, there's Denny.
And Chamberlain.
Lydia and Kitty leave without bothering to greet the hosts.
And my cousin, Mr. Collins.
May I congratulate you on your very elegant arrangements, madam. It puts me in mind greatly of perhaps you visited Rosings Park?
Oh, Colonel Forster. Mrs. Forster, enchanting.
Miss Bennet?
Mr. Bingley, who already has Jane's arm, offers his other arm to Elizabeth.
Good evening, ladies.
The officers bow. Elizabeth looks around the ballroom. Darcy notices Elizabeth and turns to gaze at her. She keeps searching and smiles as she catches Lieutenant Denny's eye. Denny approaches and bows to Elizabeth. All three bow, and Jane and Bingley leave Elizabeth.
Miss Bennet, you look quite remarkably well this evening.
Thank you.
I am instructed to convey to you, Miss Bennet, my friend Wickham's most particular regrets that he's been prevented from attending the ball. He's been obliged to go into town on the matter of urgent business, though I don't imagine it would have been so urgent had he not wished to avoid a certain gentleman.
Denny, I hope you've come prepared to dance with us tonight.
Forgive the intrusion, Mama. I would dance with both you and your sister at once if I could, but as it is...
Oh, never mind that. Come on, Denny.
Elizabeth looks around, bored, until she spots Charlotte. Elizabeth smiles and they walk towards each other.
Charlotte, I have so much to acquaint you with. Charlotte, may I present our cousin, Mr. Collins, my friend, Miss Lucas.
How do you do, sir?
Miss Lucas, I am indeed honoured to meet any friend of my fair cousin's. So many agreeable young ladies. I am quite enraptured.
Mr. Collins takes Elizabeth's hand. Elizabeth and Mr. Collins step into the dance lines and bow to each other. The dance begins, and Mr. Collins hops like a duck. The ladies dance next, and he admires Elizabeth as she moves around gracefully. Mr. Collins makes a wrong turn.
Other way, Mr. Collins.
Mr. Collins runs into a lady and tries to get back into the dance.
Oh, madam, 1,000...
Come, Mr. Collins.
My dear cousin, I apologise.
Darcy witnesses the embarrassing moment and smiles in amusement as Elizabeth and Mr. Collins continue dancing. Elizabeth sees his smirk and turns her face away. Darcy follows them down the line, watching the dance. Dancing continues as Elizabeth gossips with Charlotte.
It's extraordinary. And are you sure it's true?
Charlotte, how could it be otherwise? Every circumstance confirms it. And Mr. Darcy has boasted to me himself of his resentful, implacable...
Lizzie!
What?
If you're not otherwise engaged, would you do me the honour of dancing the next with me, Miss Bennet?
Why, I thank you. Yes. Why could I not think of an excuse? Hateful man. I promised myself I would never dance with him.
Well, he pays you a great compliment in singling you out, Lizzie. Think what you're doing. You'd be a simpleton indeed if you let your fancy for Wickham lead you to slight a man of 10 times his consequence.
Elizabeth goes to take her place in the next dance. The dancers bow and curtsy to their partners. Elizabeth and Darcy dance.
I believe we must have some conversation, Mr. Darcy. Very little will suffice. You should say something about the dance, perhaps. I might remark on the number of couples.
You talk by rule then, when dancing?
Well, yes, sometimes it is best. Then we may enjoy the advantage of saying as little as possible.
You consult your own feelings in this case, or seek to gratify mine?
Both, I imagine. We are each of an unsocial, taciturn disposition, unwilling to speak unless we are expected to say something that will amaze the whole room.
This is no very striking resemblance of your own character, I'm sure. Do you often walk into Meryton?
Yes, quite often. When you met us the other day, we had just been forming a new acquaintance.
Mr. Wickham has the happy manners that enable him to make friends. Whether he is equally capable of keeping them is less certain.
He has been unlucky as to lose your friendship in a way he is likely to suffer from all his life.
Allow me to congratulate you, sir. Such superior dancing is rarely to be seen. I'm sure you know your fair partner is well worthy of you. I hope to have this pleasure often repeated, especially when a certain desirable event takes place. Eh, Miss Lizzie? What congratulations will then flow in?
Sir,
Nay, I understand. I'll not detain you one moment longer from your bewitching partner, sir. A pleasure, sir. Capital! Capital!
I remember hearing you once say that you hardly ever forgave, that your resentment once created was implacable. You are very careful, are you not, in allowing your resentment to be created?
I am.
And never allow yourself to be blinded by prejudice?
I hope not. May I ask to which these questions tend?
Merely to the illustration of your character. I'm trying to make it out.
And what is your success?
I do not get on at all. I hear such different accounts of you as to puzzle me exceedingly.
I wish, Miss Bennet, that you would not attempt to sketch my character at the present moment. I fear the performance would reflect no credit on either of us.
But if I don't take your likeness now, I may never have another opportunity.
I would by no means suspend any pleasure of yours.
Darcy bows sharply. Elizabeth curtsies and Darcy leaves. Guests are seated and standing around dining tables filled with food. Elizabeth laughs at the end of the conversation and then walks toward Miss Bingley.
So, Miss Eliza, I hear you're quite delighted with George Wickham. No doubt he forgot to tell you, among his other communications, that he is merely the son of old Wickham, the late Mr. Darcy's steward. But, Eliza, as a friend, let me recommend you not to give credit to all his assertions. Wickham treated Darcy in an infamous manner.
Has he? How?
Don't remember the particulars, but I do know that Mr. Darcy was not in the least to blame. I pity you, Eliza, for the discovery of your favourite's guilt. But really, considering his descent, one could not expect much better.
His guilt and his descent appear, by your account, to be the same. I've heard you accuse him of being nothing worse than the son of Mr. Darcy's steward, and he informed me of that himself.
Beg your pardon. Excuse my interference. It was kindly meant.
Miss Bingley walks away from Elizabeth, offended. Elizabeth sighs and heads for the punch bowl. Jane notices and follows Elizabeth.
Insolent girl.
Lizzie.
I see nothing in her paltry attack but her own wilful ignorance in a man such as Mr. Darcy.
Yes, but Lizzie, Mr. Bingley did say that though he does not know the whole of the story, he fears that Mr. Wickham is by no means a respectable young man.
Does he know Mr. Wickham himself?
No, not at all.
Well then, he has had his account from Mr. Darcy. I've not the least doubt of Mr. Bingley's sincerity. Of course, he would believe his friend, and it does him credit. But as to the other two gentlemen, I should venture to think of them both as I did before.
Shall we not have some music? I have a great desire for a song. Caroline, can we persuade you?
Mary gets up and rushes to the piano.
Miss Mary Bennet, I see you have anticipated me.
Mary begins.
Green boughs will cover thee, come as breathe over thee, where thou art laid.
They haven't been introduced yet. Can we not prevent him?
Too late.
Mr. Darcy, I have made a remarkable, I must say, an amazing discovery. I understand you are the nephew of Lady Catherine de Bourgh of Rosings Park. Well, Mr. Darcy, I am in the happy position of being able to inform you that her ladyship was in the best of health 8 days ago.
I'm glad to hear it. And what is your name, sir?
My name is William Collins, Mr. Darcy.
Mr. Darcy walks away.
And I have the great honour to... Well...
Mary attempts to start a new tune. Mr. Bennet rises quickly and rushes to the piano.
You do extremely well, child. You've delighted us long enough. Let the other young ladies, let them display.
Mary sadly takes off her glasses and brings her music with her. Conversation begins again.
If I was so fortunate as to be able to sing, I should have great pleasure, I'm sure, in obliging the company with an air. Indeed, I should, for...
Mr. Collins stands and walks toward the piano.
I consider music a very innocent diversion.
Mrs. Hurst rushes to the piano.
And perfectly compatible with the profession of a clergyman.
Mrs. Hurst sits at the piano and begins playing beautifully.
Mr. Collins is such a sensible, respectable young man, and he's taken quite a fancy to Lizzie. Oh, and I don't think he could find a better wife. But he did favour Jane at first. Oh, but Mr. Bingley was there before him. Now, well, that will be a great marriage. And of course, you know, that will throw the girls into the path of other rich men.
Lydia!
Lydia giggles as she enters with a stolen sword and 2 officers chasing her. Kitty is close behind.
Lydia! Lydia!
Lydia and the officer bump into Elizabeth, who tries not to spill her drink. The officer retrieves his sword from Lydia and she collapses ungracefully into a chair.
Oh, Lord! Denny, fetch me a glass of wine. I can scarce draw breath. I'm so fagged.
Elizabeth looks on, mortified. Kitty and Elizabeth walk into the drawing room together.
And Chamberlain did, and then Denny again, and Lydia had already danced with him twice. I thought Mary sang very ill.
Oh, yes, poor Mary. But she is determined to do it.
More fool her, I say. Mr. Collins trod on my frock and tore it, you know.
Lizzie! Lizzie, my dear! Mr. Collins, I'm sure there can be no objection.
Kitty, don't leave me.
Oh, Lizzie, dear.
Lizzie, what's the matter? It's only Mr. Collins.
Come, Kitty, I want you upstairs. Mr. Collins has something he wants to say to Lizzie.
Dear Mamma, don't go. Mr. Collins must excuse me. He can have nothing to say that anyone could not hear.
Lizzie, I insist you stay where you are and hear Mr. Collins. Come, Kitty, come along.
Mrs. Bennet closes the door and pauses to listen before leaving. Elizabeth moves away from Mr. Collins as he steps forward.
Believe me, my dear Miss Elizabeth, that your modesty adds to your other perfections, but you can hardly doubt the object of my discourse, however your feminine delicacy may lead you to dissemble. For almost as soon as I entered the house, I singled you out as the companion of my future life. But before I am run away by my feelings on this subject, perhaps it would be advisable for me to state my reasons for marrying.
Mr. Collins.
My reasons for marrying are, first, that I think it a right thing for every clergyman to set the example of matrimony in his parish. Secondly, that I'm convinced it will add very greatly to my happiness. And thirdly, which perhaps I should have mentioned first, that it is the particular recommendation of my noble patroness, Lady Catherine de Bourgh. Mr. Collins, she said, you must marry. Choose properly, she said. Choose a gentlewoman for my sake, and for your own, let her be an active, useful sort of person, not brought up too high. Find such a woman as soon as you can. Bring her to Hunsford, and I will visit her. And your wit and vivacity, I think, must be acceptable to her when tempered by the silence and respect which her rank will inevitably excite. Yes, but so much for my general intention in favour of matrimony. Now, as to my particular choice, my dear cousin, being as I am to inherit all this estate after the death of your father, I could not satisfy myself without resolving to choose a wife from among his daughters. And now nothing remains.
Mr. Collins gets down on his knee in front of her.
But to assure you in the most animated language of the violence of my affections.
Mr. Collins, please.
To fortune I am perfectly indifferent. I am well aware that £1,000 and 4% is all you may ever be entitled to, but rest assured, I shall never reproach you on that score when we are married.
You are too hasty, sir. You forget that I have made no answer, and let me do so now. I thank you for your compliments. I am very sensible of the honour of your proposals, but it is impossible for me to accept them.
But I am by no means discouraged, indeed not. I understand that it is usual for young ladies to reject the address of the man they secretly mean to accept when he first applies for their favour. And therefore I shall hope, my dear cousin, to lead you to the altar before long.
Upon my word, your hope is an extraordinary one in view of my declaration. I was perfectly serious in my refusal. You could not make me happy. and I am convinced that I am the last woman in the world who could make you so.
My dear Miss Elizabeth, my situation in life and my connection with the noble family of de Burgh are circumstances highly in my favour. You should consider that it is by no means certain that another offer of marriage may ever be made to you. You cannot be serious in your rejection. I must attribute it to your wish of increasing my love by suspense in the usual manner of elegant females.
I assure you, sir, that I have no pretensions to the kind of elegance which consists in tormenting a respectable man. I thank you for the honour of your proposals, but to accept them is absolutely impossible. My feelings forbid it in every respect. Can I speak plainer?
You are uniformly charming, and I am persuaded that when sanctioned by your excellent parents, my...
Elizabeth turns on her heel and marches to the door. She opens it and marches off.
My proposals will not fail of being acceptable. Oh.
Mr. Collins, now sweating, sadly wipes his brow. Mrs. Bennet enters Mr. Bennet's study. He is reading.
Oh, Mr. Bennet, you are wanted immediately, for we are in uproar. Oh, you must come and make Lizzie marry Mr. Collins, for she vows she will not have him, and if you do not make haste, well, Mr. Collins will change his mind and he will not have her.
I have not the pleasure of understanding you. Of what are you talking?
Of Mr. Collins and Lizzie. Lizzie declares she will not have Mr. Collins, and Mr. Collins begins to say that he will not have Lizzie.
Well, what am I to do on the occasion? Seems a hopeless business.
Oh, speak to Lizzie about it yourself. Look, tell her that you insist upon her marrying him.
Let her come in.
Lizzie, your father wishes to speak to you.
Elizabeth marches in and looks at her father. Mrs. Bennet closes the door. Mr. Bennet stands.
Come here, my child. I understand Mr. Collins has made you an offer of marriage. Is it true?
Yes, sir.
Right, very well. And this offer of marriage you have refused.
I have.
I see. Right, well, here we come to the point. Your mother insists on your accepting it. Is it not so, Mrs. Bennet?
Yes, or I will never see her again.
Well, an unhappy alternative is before you, Elizabeth. From this day, you must be a stranger to one of your parents. Your mother will never see you again if you do not marry Mr. Collins. And I will never see you again if you do.
Oh, Mr. Bennet!
Elizabeth looks at her father. Mr. Bennet returns to his chair. Mrs. Bennet cries and sits in a chair. Meanwhile, Lydia and Kitty walk out of the house in travelling clothes and purses.
Why, Charlotte, what do you do here?
I'm come to see Elizabeth.
Mr. Collins has made Lizzie an offer, and what do you think? She won't have him.
Well, then I'm very sorry for him, though I couldn't say I'm surprised.
Mamma's beside herself. He says he won't stay another night.
I wonder, should I invite him to dine with us this evening?
Aye, do. Do take him away and feed him, for he has been in high dudgeon all morning.
Mr. Collins puts on his travelling clothes as Charlotte waits for him.
Oh, Mr. Collins.
I am resigned. Resignation is never so perfect as when the blessing denied begins to lose somewhat of its value in our estimation. Until tomorrow, then, madam, I leave.
Mr. Collins and Charlotte exit, and Mrs. Bennet waves at them with her handkerchief.
Oh,